Jose Pablo Vasquez, and Alonso Alfaro, who's at the Central Bank in Costa Rica, and my colleague Cecile Gobert at Berkeley. So what's this paper all about? What is responsible sourcing? So the adoption by multinational enterprises of required standards on working conditions at their suppliers has become widespread. So this is not the multinational saying, here's what we do for our own workers. This is the multinational saying, we've already done great things for our own workers. And this is sort of corporate social responsibility 2.0, which means that we're also going to tell our suppliers that they have to have certain standards in place if they want to do business with us. So think of Walmart, think of any global brand that you have. They, over the last couple of years, have rolled out supplier codes of conduct. These supplier codes of conduct include requirements on wage floors, worker benefits, maximum hours worked, safety standards, sick maternity leave policies, worker representation, and also, of course, environmental standards and other stuff. And the stated objectives of this responsible sourcing, if you go into the OECD or the ILO, who have been leaders in this space, is to homogenize working conditions and benefit workers and firms in developing countries. This has been increasing. If you Google your favorite multinational, you will very likely find a supply code of conduct that has been rolled out over recent years. However, we currently don't really know if these policies are just like gimmicks and hot air. You put it on your website to attract the benevolence of your customers. And we also don't know, so if they're not just hot air, but if they actually impact exposed suppliers in sourcing origin countries, we don't really know how to think through the incidence of these policies. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And for whom? So for that, we try to make three main contributions in this paper. Number one, we wanted to write down a theory to think this through. So imagine for a second that responsible sourcing is not just hot air, and that responsible sourcing meaningfully changes the marginal cost of production for suppliers worldwide, and in particular the labor-related marginal costs, because these provisions are very heavy on how you treat your workers. So a lot of it is labor-related. So in that world, we wanted to think through, a pretty general model, because we didn't want to make stark assumptions ex ante. So we wanted to nest alternative hypotheses about the market environment and the motivation of why multinationals roll this out. And in this environment, we want to derive two sets of results from the model. The first is we want to get partial equilibrium comparative statics. So what happens to one supplier that happens to supply to Coca-Cola in a given period, compared to a different supplier that happens to supply to Pepsi. When Coca-Cola is the only thing that happens in the economy, it rolls out as a new supplier code of conduct. What happens to the exposed supplier compared to the non-exposed supplier in partial equilibrium? It's just Coca-Cola doing it. Nothing changes in the aggregates or in the labor market. And the reason we wanted to derive these comparative statics is because that's the kind of stuff we can take to the event studies and the data that we've collected. And then the second set of objectives is to derive in general equilibrium if, all the multinationals in the country or a significant fraction of the multinational production in the country is rolling out these supply codes of conduct. What would be the general equilibrium consequences on labor markets, on real incomes of different types of workers? So that's what we do on the theory side. We then build a new database. So if you think about, if you want to know what happens because of supply codes of conduct, the ideal data set that you can imagine is you want firm-to-firm transaction data so that you can see which domestic suppliers are exposed to which multinationals. You want to ideally, link that firm-to-firm data with matched employee data, so you can follow workers before and after supply codes of conduct hit an exposed supplier. And of course, you want a database where you see the identity of the multinationals and you link that identity of the multinationals to a database of rollouts. So that's exactly what we try to build in Costa Rica. So in Costa Rica, we have 481 multinational firms that have subsidiaries on the ground that are doing significant sourcing in Costa Rica. So we use a cutoff, I'll show you in the data, but it's 481 firms that have any sort of significant amount of domestic sourcing. Out of these 481 multinationals, 135 of them roll out supply codes of conduct, responsible sourcing codes of conduct since 2009, and the data goes to 2019, so 1 decade. So by the end of our sample, 38% of all non-multinational Costa Rican production is under a binding supply code of conduct. So that means that in 2019, those firms were producing and they were selling to a multinational that had an active supply code of conduct. So that was bigger than what I would have imagined looking at this, but that's fairly representative. So it's grown to become a big deal. And I'll show you, of course, what we do in the empirics. But the thought experiment to have is, you have a supply to Pepsi, you have a supply to Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola does something in 2012 that Pepsi doesn't do, and then we see the full event study timeline of the exposed supplies that were selling to Pepsi or Coca-Cola in the year before the rollout event, and see how their outcomes evolve on the wages of their workers, on the sales of the firm, and so forth. That's what we do in the empirical analysis. And then the third step, yeah, please.
Ben, sorry, that 38%, that's 38% of sales of the domestic firms to the multinational, or that's the total sales of the firms that are exposed to the multinational?
Total sales of the firms. So exactly. So one important element of supplier codes of conduct is they're written as to say, in your production facility, this has to hold. So that means that you can't just apply the responsible sourcing codes of conduct to, the output that you produce for the multinational, because you're being audited on your production facilities. So that means that if you agree to a supplier code of conduct with Walmart or a different producer, then those standards are holding for all of production that you're doing to any buyer.
So even if you have different plants and one plant is supplying to the multinational, another plant is just supplying to non-multinational, the multinational is going to be concerned also for the other plants as well?
So in principle, it applies to the legal unit. So if you have an enterprise that has multiple production facilities, in principle, it applies to the company that sells to the multinational. And then the question is one of compliance, right? So do suppliers split out a production line in a facility that becomes its own enterprise that does these to limit the cost? We'll have some additional evidence on this, but what I'll be able to show you in the empirics is, with whatever enforcement and whatever cheating is going on, I'm going to give you the average incidence of those shocks on those exposed suppliers. In the background, there may be some cheating going on, which we have additional results on, but I'll show you the full picture.
Okay, great.
In the third step, we do the natural thing. We combine the two. So this second step gives us these partial equilibrium comparative statics that we can link to the model, and we're going to use those event studies to calibrate the model, to estimate the key parameters, and then take the model and then do counterfactual analysis. And in the counterfactual analysis, the question I'm going to ask is consistent with the comparative statics that we see in the data. What happens in the Costa Rican economy if they go from an equilibrium without responsible sourcing to one that I observed in 2019 with the observed amount of responsible sourcing in the economy? What happens to welfare of different worker types? That's where we're headed in the end. So a brief preview of the findings. So on the theory side, we find that the welfare incidence of responsible sourcing is a priori ambiguous. And in the most stripped down version of the model, there is an interplay that holds in the most basic environment that you can write down, and that already leads to ambiguity. And that is that responsible sourcing leads to an interplay between what is akin to an export tax, which is good for the domestic economy, and a labor market distortion. And the way to think about that is, imagine that all the stuff that's produced under supply codes of conduct, where you potentially have to increase your labor costs and increase the prices of those inputs. Imagine all of that is destined for export markets, and the multinational sells those inputs on global markets. And that, in that case, you're passing on higher production costs to the rest of the world, and the multinational is helping you to implement an export tax, which to a first order is a good thing for your home economy in terms of welfare. But also, that increased production cost and an undistorted economy is going to leak into the domestic price index for the same reason that I just discussed with Federico. And the extent that leaks into the domestic price index, that's akin to a labor market distortion. And those two things are, in the most stripped down environment, are battling against one another to see if it's good or bad for the domestic economy. Then if you level more quote unquote complicated or realistic assumptions, such as market power of the multinational, labor market power of the supplier firms, productivity shocks at the same time, these kind of things, then that interplay can change. And I'll walk you through exactly how we do it and then quantify it. In the empirics, we find that responsible sourcing is not just hot air. And to be fully transparent, I think none of us expected to find as clear-cut effects in the Costa Rican environment as we did. This paper started many years ago in the Congo, where the electronics industry gave us a lot of money to get rid of child labor in their cobalt mines. That's how interest in responsible sourcing grew among this team, and then that fell through for various reasons. And then we found a great data environment in Costa Rica, and we're like, let's see. But of course, Costa Rica has much better enforced labor laws, environmental laws, so it wasn't clear if it was just going to be hot air in the Costa Rican environment. And it turns out to not be hot air in the Costa Rican environment. And I'll walk you through that why we think this is plausible and why we think those results are there. So if you believe our empirical strategy, and I'll show you what we do, then 4 years after getting a new supplier code of conduct dropped on you, so you were a supplier that was selling to a multinational the year before the policy was rolled out, and then I trace you compared to another supplier to a different multinational over the same time. 4 years after the rollout, your sales have gone down by 7%. That's total output of the entity, total output of the firm, and your employment has gone down 6%. Your average wages increase, and that wage increase is driven by initially low wage workers. So the quarter of initial workers in the national wage distribution, their wages go up by about 4 to 5%. And in line with that, the relative employment of initially low wage workers goes down by about 12%. Okay, so these are results that are consistent with what we read in those codes of conduct. We have the text to all of those rollouts. Which is suggestive of a labor-related cost, the cost increase in production that you have to go if you want to keep selling to the multinational. And then there's going to be an extensive margin and intensive margin. There are going to be some suppliers that say, no, thank you. And there are going to be some suppliers that say, yes, we're going to do this. We're going to eat this cost. And these results, related to, like, we're not assuming perfect enforcement. We're not assuming that there's no cheating. These are just the average incidents on those firms that we see in the data.
Benjamin?
Yeah, please.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I guess maybe you're going to talk about this later, but with the responsible sourcing, I can imagine that there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of what this means. And so my question is, how can you differentiate between things that are more like mandatory? So I imagine like a pharmaceutical really needs to set some standards to their suppliers, whereas, I don't know, like a beverage company, there's more wiggle room in terms of what they do. How do you differentiate between things that are like, they're going like the extra mile to improve workers' conditions, and what are the other things that that have to do more with what they're expected to do or what they're required in their home countries?
Yeah. So that's a great point.
May I jump in, please?
Oh, please, yeah.
I had this is Ernesto from the bank. I had a similar question. Is that it's not defined yet what is this code of conduct policy. So at least for me, it's a little bit hard to map them to some type of exercise because I see it as an exercise that probably can tell us what is going to be the effect on the labor market of some regulations, something going on. So is this going to be mainly mapping into a higher minimum wage, or less downward wage rigidity, or something else?
Yeah, so these are great points. So let me answer Ernesto's point first, and then get to the heterogeneity. So to Ernesto's point, the way we think about it theoretically, and the way that the supply codes of conduct are written, is we're going to model this as an increase in the wages of initially low wage workers. Okay, so it's not the C-suite, it's not the educated white collar workers that have way above the legal minimum wage. It's not binding for those guys, but it may be binding for low wage workers. So in the production, we're going to have low wage workers and high wage workers, and those responsible sourcing codes of conduct, we're going to model that as an increase in the required wage that a supplier has to pay to initially low wage workers above the going rate in the market when the supply code of conduct hits. That's how we're going to model it, and the model is informed by some of these moments here. When we take the model to the data, I'm not just going to look at the wage increase of the 4.5% that I see here of the low wage workers and say, like, this is the policy. We're going to back out the implied cost increase of those suppliers by their sales response into the domestic market compared to other suppliers. So I'm going to say that these firms are facing a downward demand. I don't know exactly what those provisions are doing. I see some increase in low wage workers' salaries, but I don't want to take the stand that that's the only thing that's changing. Maybe there's safety regulations and benefit policies that also cost the firm. So I'm going to back out the marginal cost consistent with a decrease in their competitiveness and their sales to other non-M&E buyers in the domestic market. That's what we're going to do.
So that's going to be like a decrease in productivity.
It's going to be an increase in the labor-related marginal cost of the firm. And part of that is
because some since you have the firm to firm data, I mean, this is real world event, so there is more than way to interpret that in terms of a model. So I could envision, for instance, something that Marco was saying, like in the chemistry industry, higher security standards basically means buying more intermediate inputs of higher prices, and that is, I'm not sure whether the mapping, whether all these different way of conceptualizing the effects are going to lead to the same results.
Yeah. So, and that also relates to what Marco said about the heterogeneity. So let me contextualize what we're doing here. So, there's some existing literature on responsible sourcing, and what those papers tend to have done is to pick one particular responsible sourcing, sort of like a case study, right? So Gap did this in 1991, and then you can be super specific, right? Like in paragraph A, they say this, in paragraph B, they say this. What we're trying to do here is to be more, like, a little more systematic and be like, lots of companies are doing this. What's the average incidence of those things? Now, I told you 135 of those guys are rolling out. I think the rollout events are like close to between 140 and 50. So we have the PDF of the supply codes of conduct, but you can imagine that there's a lot of information in those things. So what we're doing here is to give you the average incidence, and then to Marco's point, we are going to look at the heterogeneity, but to a very, like, I'm going to both ask, like, these are the average effects that I'm stating here in the summary, and I'm going to show you what type of supplier is this average driven by, and what type of responsible sourcing rollout is this driven by. And I'm going to do things like splitting it up by firm size on the supplier side, by sector on the supplier side. And for the multinationals, I'm going to do things like splitting it up by the labor regulations of the origin country of the multinational, or by the management score of the origin country. Just, like, very crude. And then, in the future, one could, like, really dig into the textual analysis and see what's going on. But all of the texts that we're using in the empirics, they all have labor-related provisions, and we're going to zoom in on the labor-related provisions. And, things like that, they also have, like, environmental standards and the environmental impact of those policies, we're going to leave for future research. So we're going to zoom in on the labor-related incidence of these policies, and then quantify what it does to workers, because benefiting workers in sourcing origin countries is one of the main stated objectives of these policies. But, like, I fully agree with all your comments. There's tons of detail in there, and we're going to give you an average across hundreds and hundreds of these events in Costa Rica. All right, so in the quantification, when we take that evidence and combine it with our model, what we're finding is that responsible sourcing has succeeded in one important respect, and that is to increase the welfare of low-wage workers working at ex-ante exposed firms. So before responsible sourcing hit, the workers that are employed at the plants that are selling to the multinationals doing this, they see a welfare gain of about 9%. Okay. And that is driven by both the extra money that they get, as well as, it's the group of workers. So it's not the guys that are lucky to stay at those firms. It's the guys that were employed there. So this includes the group of workers that get fired because of this, right? However, right, these are only about 20% of workers, like, of low-wage workers in all of Costa Rica, that ever get exposed to responsible sourcing contracts in the economy. The remaining 80% of low-wage workers see a significant decrease in their welfare. Why? Because their wages is going down relative to high-wage workers, right? So you see a reduction in labor demand for low-wage workers. These guys are being fired, consistent with what we're finding in the data. And the domestic price index is going up, because this stuff leaks into the domestic price index. So while you benefit low-wage workers working at suppliers that are lucky to be selling to these multinationals that are rolling this out, you're hurting otherwise identical low-wage workers in the rest of the economy, and those tend to be the majority, is the current takeaway that we're finding. The rest, like in terms of aggregate outcomes, if you take the representative agent of this economy, the effects are really, really small. So neither high-wage workers nor the group of low-wage workers, like, responsible sourcing is not a huge macroeconomic event, but you see this stark heterogeneity within the bottom quarter of low-wage workers. Okay. All right.
Sorry,
so,
do you
yeah.
compare this, like what's the benchmark? Do you compare this with, like, the alternative policy of making transfers and implementing the appropriate taxes to kind of do this, not through the firm but through social policy?
No, we don't do optimal policy. obviously you could do this more effectively. So if your wish was to benefit 20% of 25% of workers, and give them a real wage increase, obviously you could do this more effectively than the multinationals. The argument by places like the ILO, the OECD, that are big fans of responsible sourcing, is that, you know, in developing countries you have weak institutions and there's market failures, and these are sort of like second best options that the multinational can do this. We have that possibility in our model. Like in our model, we will have a version of our model where the wages are inefficiently marked down in the pre-existing equilibrium. The multinationals come in and they increase the wages, and you know that's a good thing to the first order for the domestic welfare. We have that possibility. We don't find it supported in the data, and then we're ending up with these sort of mixed bag results.
Yeah.
All right. There's an existing literature on FDI. There's a smaller literature on responsible sourcing. I think we're the first paper that tries to model this stuff in GE, and that tries to not just pick one event, but have systematic evidence to link it to the model to give you a brief overview. Okay, I will be out of time by the end, judging by the interactions we have. So I'm going to go quickly through model and data, hope to get through the empirical evidence, and then show you how we take the evidence to calibrate the model, and show you just one welfare result that will give the point estimates. So I'm going to start with a very basic environment. On top of that, we're going to layer some different hypotheses for how responsible sourcing happens. So take the home economy, which is Costa Rica, and the rest of the world, which is other countries. There are workers in these countries that have our beloved CES preferences, where there's varieties omega being produced. There's an elasticity of substitution sigma, and those, you know, there's a taste shifter, like it's an asymmetric CES. There's a taste shifter for different varieties. That taste shifter is going to show up again when I talk about the motivation of the multinational. There's two types of workers: initially low-wage workers, for whom responsible sourcing may be a thing, and high-wage workers, for whom responsible sourcing is unlikely to be ever targeted at them. And they are imperfect substitutes with an elasticity of substitution in production of row. There's only labor in the economy. There's no capital. There's no profits. Everybody's going to the workers in a simple starting version. How is production happening? There's a final good that's produced both by non-M&E domestic firms, so home firms. Think of a metals model. They are heterogeneous domestic firms. There's a productivity distribution that's Pareto with a theta shape parameter. They only use labor and then an aggregate labor of both different types. And there is subsidiaries of multinationals on the ground in Costa Rica, and they use labor as well as domestic inputs that suppliers supply to them in this production function here. That's the multinational output. All firms can both sell on the domestic market and export stuff abroad, the multinational and the domestic firms. And there's three types of cutoffs. There's an entry cutoff into the domestic market. There's a cutoff to exporting, and there's a cutoff to selling to the multinational. So there will be selection, and only the most productive guys are going to sell to the multinational subsidiary. And then, you know, the heterogeneity of how this is going to affect you is the multinational is going to make selling to them slightly less attractive when we roll out responsible sourcing. If you were way above the productivity cutoff to sell to that multinational previously, you're more likely to say, okay, that's still good for me. I'm still going to do this. If you were just above the productivity cutoff, you're going to be on the extensive margin and say no and stop selling to the multinational. In the baseline, there's monopolistic competition in all markets. So until now, a plain vanilla economic setup. How do we introduce responsible sourcing? We're going to introduce responsible sourcing by saying that if you want to sell to the multinational, you have to pay tau greater than 1 of the going wage for initially low-wage workers in the home labor market. The high-wage workers are not going to be affected. So the multinational comes in and says, you know, somehow I'm going to mark up the labor-related costs for low-wage workers. This could be in benefits. This could be in actual compensation. This could be maximum hours worked. This could be formality requirements where you had some informal workers and now you actually have to pay them more. So this is just increasing the cost of a low-wage factor of production for them. That's how we model. Now, on top of this basic
why do you restrict that ex ante? I mean, it could be that you're gonna increase it a little bit for the low guys and decrease it for the high guys. I mean, you could have just flexible wedges that are applied, you know, maybe different policies will do. I mean, different firms will do it in a different way, but why do you need to restrict it only for one type of workers?
We don't have to. It's going to be consistent with what we're going to find, but that's the cheap answer. The more distinct answer is going to come on the next slide, and just hold me. So on top of this basic setup, we're going to we didn't want to assume like this is the only thing that happens. So for example, we didn't want to pre-assume why multinationals are doing this. We didn't want to assume what's happening to productivity at those suppliers. We didn't want to assume how much of the cost is passed through to the multinationals, and we didn't want to assume that we have a perfectly efficient labor market to start with. Each one of those bullets is going to matter for the welfare incidents. Okay, and I'm going to show you how. So the first one, in corporate social responsibility, there's a theoretical literature by Tirol and many others of like, companies agreeing to do something good, right? To do something altruistic. And that theoretical literature splits into they do it for other reasons but profit maximization, because somewhere on the board there's altruism or whatever it is, or they do this for profit maximization, okay? So if they do it without profit maximization, it's like the tau is just an exogenous thing that drops onto this model. And if they do it for profit maximization, then in principle, you can solve for the optimal tau that they want to do. The easiest way to model a profit incentive for doing this for multinationals is to let that variety-specific demand shifter that multinationals are facing in world markets to be a function of your sourcing practices, right? So if this thing is larger than 0, then the multinational says, hey, if we advertise that we are a responsible sourcer, then our demand curve globally is going to shift out. And I can off-weigh that shift of the demand curve to the increase in production costs, and that's the optimal level of responsible sourcing that I want to implement. So of course, if the demand of the multinational shifts contemporaneously with responsible sourcing being announced, that matters for the welfare. Think about, for example, the export tax. The export tax is going to affect the domestic market differently if the multinational that does this also sees a shift in output for itself, right? So it's going to matter for the welfare incidents. So we're going to allow for an arbitrary shift in the output demand of multinationals after they allow for responsible sourcing. The second one, and this is talking to people who have worked with firms, particular Pakistani soccer industry experts, and the notion is that when they roll out these new supply codes of conduct, they also try to soften the blow, and they transfer training and expertise and technology to increase the productivity in those establishments. This could be an option. So here I come to Federico's question. So here, the assumption that responsible sourcing only shows up for low-wage workers and not for high-wage workers, that's important, because here we're going to assume that maybe after responsible sourcing, the establishment becomes more productive by a factor of T that applies to all factors of production, including the high-wage workers. So then, the simple thing to do is like, I can see what happens to low-wage workers, their wages. These guys used to be there before, they're still there after. What happens to the same person's wages on average? And I can look at the high wage workers and see what happens to their wages. And that would be a differentiating thing to see a productivity shift. We're not going to end up finding a T. So you're going to see that the wages of the initially, like anything above the top quartile is not going to move much, especially not the top 75%. So there's not going to be a wage effect, which is how we're going to rule out that there's like some aggregate productivity shock to the production. But of course, these are These are like binary assumptions of that we take to the data, like stylized. This is stylized, but this is what we allow for, that all workers get a contemporaneous production shock, so that the wages that you see are not just higher costs paid to the workers, but maybe they are also productivity increase. The third thing, and that came to mind. So I've been like through the work we did before in the Congo and elsewhere. I've been to too many industry meetings with actual multinationals at the table, and the other stakeholders, which were like Amnesty International, Global Witness, and Chinese sources. And in none of these meetings, when they wanted to ban child labor in the Congo, in the cobalt supply chain, in none of these meetings that I've been in, did the electronics industry giants ever discuss, and this is what we're going to pay for it. It was all like, our suppliers have to do this, like get the children out of the mines. And as an economist, you're like, like you may want to offer something in return if you impose different production standards. Of course, it's a tricky issue if you talk about child labor. If you're talking about a wage floor or a formality requirement for workers that makes it more costly to employ these people, like an increase in the cost of production to their inputs is a salient thing to discuss. So it could be that these global guys, think of Walmart, just have monopoly market power over their suppliers, so that only a fraction of the cost increase that they impose on the suppliers is passed on to their input costs. And we're going to model that in a reduced form way that I'm going to estimate, like what's the fraction of the cost increase to the suppliers that is going to be passed on to the multinational. Okay, so that's beta. If it's 1, everything gets passed on, like in the plain vanilla version. And if it's below 1, then a fraction gets passed on. And that's, again, of course, going to matter for the welfare. Think about the export tax. That's not going to show up if you have to eat the cost and don't get to pass it on to the multinationals. And then the third one that I marked in gray here is we wanted to have, in the theory, we wanted to have a channel through which responsible sourcing could be a good thing, like to a first order, right? And the easiest way to do that is to say that, look, these wages are marked down by domestic suppliers. There's monopsony power on labor markets, and the multinational comes in and does what the government should have been doing and enforces a minimum wage. Okay, and that's going to be a good thing for the economy as a whole, and it's going to increase production in those suppliers, to a first order if you increase their wages. We're not going to find evidence for this, but I'm going to show you how. So this model with all these layers included gives rise to comparative statics and partial equilibrium that I can take to the data. So in particular, what we can do in the model and the data is to say you have 2 suppliers. One of them gets shocked by the multinational that we're supplying to, the other one doesn't. It's the only thing that happens in the economy. Nothing changes to aggregates like wages, nothing, or prices. What happens to the exposed supplier? So this is a guy that was selling to the multinational the period before. So a guy sitting above the productivity cutoff to one multinational, and a guy sitting above the productivity cutoff to a different multinational. What happens to those 2 firms differentially if you trace them out after the tau hits the multinational? The tau and the T hats. And of course, there's an extensive margin response. Some are dropping it. There's an intensive margin response. So this is a summary of what happens in the different layers. Okay, so if you fast forward to this layer, this is the baseline model plus allowing for productivity gains at the suppliers, plus allowing for imperfect pass-through at the suppliers, plus allowing for demand shock to the multinational. So everything that nested. What you find is that the exposed firms, the sales to the RS multinational are ambiguous. The sales to other buyers are unambiguously negative. The total sales are ambiguous because of that demand shock. And the sales among compliers are ambiguous again. Okay, so if the sales among compliers to the same multinational are ambiguous, they could be going up or down. Okay.
Ben?
Yeah.
May I ask a question about the assumption that you make a couple of slides ago about the productivity increase in both low skilled workers and high skilled workers?
Yeah.
That pink T, does it come from what you read of on these programs, or you just put it in there? Because I might assume also that most of the increased productivity uh, would be over the ones that had the increased cost, and it comes to mind the documentary of the glass firm that was the Chinese that I don't know if you watch it at Netflix, that they asked to put gloves on the people that were dealing with broken glass. So that would benefit, that type of policy would benefit only on the low skilled workers and probably not that much on the high school workers. I don't know if I.
Yeah. So it's a good point. So first of all, the history. So this is not something we had on our radar when we started writing this paper. This literally came out of conversation, and then we wanted to allow for it. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I haven't talked about how we're going to estimate these things, but we're going to estimate all of these things in the data. And the way that we're going to estimate this is sort of by like an identifying assumption that the productivity gains would show up in all workers, and the cost increase and productivity gains would show up in the low skilled workers. So you're absolutely right that to the extent that we see the wages, like that 4.5% average increase of the workers, of the low wage workers, that could be both if there's productivity gains targeted only at low wage workers and not at the rest of production. I'm not super worried at that because for all those reasons, right? Like one way through the lens of the model I've already written down, like through the lens of the model that I've written down here, if I looked at what happens to the identical person being employed at the supplier, both before and after the responsible sourcing code of conduct hits, and I see that you're a complier, that you're still selling to the multinational, looking at their wages through the lens of the model should give me top. Okay. right? Like just looking at one event. But I'm not going to make that assumption when I take the model to the data for precisely those reasons that I can't fully observe what's going on. So this is sort of what I previewed. Is like the way that I'm going to estimate the cost increase to those suppliers is not just by looking at wages. The way that I'm going to estimate the cost increase is by looking how they decrease in competitiveness relative to other sellers into a non-responsible sourcing market, into the domestic market. So if I know, right, like that they face a downward sloping demand and I parameterize that, and I see that your sales are going down by whatever percent relative to my sales, I can back out what must have happened to your marginal cost.
Okay.
And it's for that reason that I want to take that holistic view that is not just showing up in the wages, because that productivity gain, right, wouldn't hurt your competitiveness, but the cost increase would. And that's how I'm going to back out the tau in the end. For all those reasons of the intricacies that I won't be able to observe exactly. So I think we're good on that front. If we only had looked at the salaries of those workers, I agree with you. It could have been either or. Like I would have called it a cost increase, but it could have been a productivity increase. I agree.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so in the labor market monopsony model, there are two things that are just not going to be in the data. So in particular, the sales. So right, if you have downward market wages and then I slap a tau on you, then what should happen is that your sales should go down. Should go up, and they should go up to other buyers, and they should go up to the multinational, and we're just not seeing those unambiguous positive signs in the data, which is why we're gonna discard this thing when we take the model and do counterfactual analysis. But that's previewing what's going to come out of this. So if you take the model that I've presented you and you simplify it in just two ways, okay? So you change the multinational production function to not have value added. So they only assemble inputs from the domestic market. There's no labor usage. And you simplify the trading structure. You say all of Costa Rican exports have to be done by multinationals, and 100% of multinational production is exported. So if you make these two stark assumptions, then I can give you a very nice welfare expression, okay? So to a first order, what happens to a representative agent in the sourcing origin country's welfare? So that's the representative agent pooled across both labor types. Is this beautifully simple function in this simplified version of our model where all the exports are done by multinationals and where the multinationals don't have value added, they just use the inputs and ship it all out. And that's just for intuition. The real welfare formula that we're going to quantify in the data is the full model, and that would be pages of closed form solutions. So we're going to do that on the computer. But here's the simple version for intuition in the simplified version. So forget about the red and the light blue terms here, and just take the most basic version of the model without a demand shock of the multinational and without productivity shocks. Responsible sourcing is going to increase welfare if the pass-through to the multinational is large, so if beta is 1. The leakage onto the domestic price index is small. So the leakage is if the firms that are affected by responsible sourcing mainly sell to the multinational and don't sell to the domestic market, then this leakage term is going to not hurt the domestic price index, right? And then all that you're left with is an export tax, W tax, that is scaled to the fraction of production that is going to be affected in the economy. The Chi-L is the cost share of low-wage workers, which is going to be roughly 20%. I think it's going to be 19% in our calibration. And the tau is the cost increase. So this dark blue thing here is the export tax to the domestic economy. If leakage is not there and beta is 1, so if leakage is 0 and beta is 1, then the only thing the policy does is an export tax, and it's going to increase domestic welfare to a first order. If the pass-through isn't perfectly there or leakage is there, this could be negative. So that's the basic interplay that you have in any kind of model version when you model multinationals changing their requirements on domestic suppliers. On top of that, you have, of course, a benefit to the domestic economy to the extent that productivity is increased on suppliers, that is scaled to the fraction of production affected. And it's a good thing to get a positive demand shock on your exports, which is going to be again scaled by the domestic production that is selling to multinationals. So if I click on these sufficient statistics, you're going to see lots of lambdas, which are going to be the trade shares, trading with yourself, just like in an ACR world. The reason that is so nice and neat in this first order expression is because all of the exports are going to be driven by RS multinationals, responsible sourcing multinationals. So everything is going to fold into these nice sufficient statistics. All of that breaks down if you don't make these two simplifying assumptions, or if you go beyond the first order, which is what we're going to quantify. On the distributional side, you can show that responsible sourcing is weakly benefiting initially low-wage workers in the simplified version. And you can further break out the welfare benefit to workers that are initially employed at exposed firms and otherwise identical low or high wage workers in the economy, which is what I'm going to do in the quantification. Okay. So with that said, I'm now going to jump into data and context, but maybe it's a good time for a pit stop if there's any other questions on the theories.
Okay. Ben, you've been loading sort of everything on labor market, but is there something else on like input quality or input standards that would also kind of affect workers maybe indirectly, but not because they're asking for like better conditions for workers, but more like, you know, improve your inputs, make it safer to produce, so you have more safety standards or whatever, like other things that have to do with what you buy and not sort of which workers or how much you pay workers.
Yeah, so in the model, the domestic suppliers only use labor, right? And like through that lens, responsible sourcing really what it does is just an increase in the marginal cost of production, right? And I'm going to level that onto the cost share of low wage workers, which is a particular, right? Like that is a stylized assumption. But I think the general notion of what we're trying to do goes through if you have more complex text that affect the types of machines you can use or the types of inputs that you can buy that are more safe to workers. Like you're basically forcing suppliers to do something that they weren't doing before. Probably they weren't doing it because it was more costly and they didn't want to. And you're increasing their cost of production. And I think we captured, so in the model we only have these two factors of production, and we're going to level it. But I think in spirit it's very close. And yes, of course, we could write down a model where you have 15 factors of production and then trying to disentangle which one of them goes up. I'm not going to do that, partly because the supplier codes of conduct that we have, they all have labor-related provisions. I'm going to show you like a little text analysis that workers and safety and like anything worker-related is really what stands out.
Okay, and yeah, and I guess you don't have prices on these firm-to-firm transactions, so you wouldn't be able to look at quality or stuff like that.
Good point. So I think in the final years of the transaction data in Costa Rica, you can get unit values, so not prices, but unit values. We haven't gotten there. I don't think anybody's used that, and I think it would be available for maybe 2019 onwards. So something we could check, but not in the database that we have. Okay, so empirically, we're going to use 7 data sets and then build on top of that the responsible sourcing data set. So, Isabella and Jose and Alonso have used these data. They're amazing data, almost as amazing as the Chilean data available. So you have firm-to-firm transactions, you have matched employee data, you have corporate income tax returns, you have customs records, so you can link everything to trade flows, and you have a foreign ownership registry. So you can observe subsidiaries, and then you can link them to workers and firms in the economy. For 2008 to 2019, the reason I'm going to, in the empirics, use 2009 onwards is because in 2008 I can observe who was exposed or not, and then roll that forward. We use 2 additional data sets that we link to that are not within Costa Rica. One, we link it to the global outcomes of these multinationals in the Orbis database. So we don't just have sales of the subsidiary in Costa Rica, but the global sales of that group that roll out the supply code of conduct. And we have some cool data on NGO campaigns against sourcing standards of multinationals that I probably won't have time to get into, but it's a really neat database that Pamina Koenig and others have used before. So on top of that, we built the database that we really need for responsible sourcing. So we had 2 teams of double-blind entry that were searching the web and non-web records for multinationals, both globally and the subsidiaries in Costa Rica, for supply code of conduct. Now, the good news is that you don't do responsible sourcing without telling people about it. So it's not something secret that the firm does. So we were able to find the vast majority of supply codes of conduct. I was thinking, oh, maybe it's in filings that they have to do or in annual reports that you have to look into. But no, most of those firms had it on their global website, and most of the supply codes of conduct are globally in scope. So it's not targeted at the Caribbean, it's not targeted at Latin America. It's mainly every supplier, no matter where we are in the world, is going to have to abide by these standards. That is the vast majority of these supply codes of conduct. So some descriptive statistics on this. So the first one, like, who are the MNEs in Costa Rica that rolled this out? That's not super surprising, right? These are MNEs that are in the US and Europe mainly, then all sectors of production. And here's examples of each one of them. So Boston Scientific in manufacturing, Cisco Systems and Services, Walmart in retail, and Standard Fruit in agriculture. What was more eye-opening for what we're going to find was this. The vast majority of firms that are supplying to multinationals in the setting are services firms. So if you take, services and retail together, that's like 80% of the exposed suppliers. So I was always thinking of supplier codes of conduct as like, I have a, specialized input producer that gives me some manufactured tubes, and I'm going to use that in my global sales of like output that I'm going to ship abroad. But no, multinationals have office buildings, and they need transportation, they need cleaning, they need furniture services, they need all types of local services. And these, local services, so the average firm, and the median is even lower, the average firm has 16 workers and a small amount of sales. So think about the cleaning services that the multinational orders, right? So in Costa Rica, I didn't have much hope for finding anything for like a large manufacturing plant that produces for Boston Scientific, because they would not have informal workers. They would be fully above the books and probably pay above median wages for everybody that they employ. But the cleaning firms that clean the office buildings to multinational subsidiaries, that is small services establishments with probably pretty weak pre-existing labor regulations, and I'm going to get to that in the previous slide. So, and then it goes from 18% of exposed non multinational production in Costa Rica in 2009 to close to 40% in 2019. So a large part of Costa Rican production is at the same time selling to a firm that has an active RS code of conduct. So you needed to sign that supply code of conduct that includes random audits and all of these things. And it's increasing over time. So what are these responsible sourcing codes of conduct? They all have labor provisions. The five
Very
most,
brief.
yeah.
I'm sorry. So
yeah.
Does this mean that when a firm is going to sign a contract to provide a service to one of these multinationals, already knows that there is the latent probability that they're going to be subject to this code of conduct if they are not subject already?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So,
Okay.
like all of these codes of conduct include, enforcement and random audit provisions. And then, how multinationals enforce this, there may be heterogeneity there, right? So, large multinationals with a reputation on the line, they may take this very seriously. A multinational from, yeah.
Okay, but even if I am selling to a multinational that does not have this code of conduct, I still must internalize the possibility that I'm going to be forced to fulfill one of those in the future.
It could be, yeah, that you're forward looking, you see what's happening around you, and then you can always sell to them. Unless you have some sunk cost, fixed cost of selling to them, like as long as they want to buy from you and you see an opportunity to sell to them, even if you expect in the future that they may roll this out, you would still sell to them in a simple model. Now you can be more complicated and have relationship specific investments, and then you say like, oh no, in 2 years you may come back. So in a more complicated model, there may be an effect like previewing it. I don't think it's going to show up in the empirics, but you can talk to me if you think this is going to stand out.
Okay, so I'm worried about selection. That's all.
Selection of selling to any multinational, or selection of selling. Yeah, so the selection in our model is going to be, right, the large guys, the more productive guys are going to be above the cut of a selling. That you see very, very clearly in the data. And then the selection would be like conditional on firm size, who selects into selling to a multinational. Again, in our model, there's nothing relationship specific that you have to bleed for. So you would sell to them even if you had the expectation that they will, that they would roll out on you before. In a more complicated version, I don't know. I'm going to show you what we do empirically. Even if there's selection, I think it would basically land on who are we estimating these effects on rather than it's a bias. You see what I mean? Like, I think it would load on like how representative is this average effect rather than is the effect biased, is my gut feeling. But you can come back to me. Okay.
Ben,
so
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. It's very interesting. Do you have a sense of the timing? Why are, like, for a given multinational over time, why is it the case that it starts in a particular year? Is it because that's where it started everywhere for that multinational in the world? Or is it like the multinational has the standards and then it's gradually implementing it across countries depending on local circumstances and maybe, what's happening in the country, maybe it gives a reason for why the multinational starts there or not and so on? You have a sense of like why they do it at some point in time?
Yeah. So those questions are the reason why we wanted to link it to the Orbis data so that we can see the timeline of global outcomes before and after. And some of the, I mean, so like we haven't talked about empirics, but like the notion that I'm going to try to give you on the way is like, if you're a cleaning service in Costa Rica, IBM or Walmart is not going to target a supply code of conduct to all of its suppliers worldwide to your productivity shock. Like that's the basic notion I'm going to give you, right? So if I look at what happens to services establishments or sellers in Costa Rica, and these are global rollout events, I'm pretty certain that it's not timed at contemporaneous shocks to these suppliers. Okay, because I use the global rollout events, like in everything that I'm going to do. This is the board in New York City deciding what to do on supply codes of conduct for all suppliers worldwide. So I'm pretty sure that they don't target Costa Rican productivity shocks. Like that's number one. Now you could still have a problem, of course. Like for example, if you look at the intensive margin sales to the multinational that is rolling this out, there it still matters if the multinational is rolling this out at a time when they see increased or decreased sales with pre-existing trends, right? Then I could wrongly conclude that the intensive margin effect of sales to the multinational for compliers are upward or downward, which I'm partly going to use for model calibration. So there I still need to take a stance. It's like, is the multinational rolling this out as good as exogenously, or is it rolling it out with productivity shocks or negative demand shocks? And I'm going to talk a little bit about this, which is also part where we want to look at the Orbis timeline. So I'll come back to these questions, but it's a great point.
Sure.
Okay, so just to preview a little bit of why what we're going to find is not super surprising is, so these supply codes of conduct, they have labor and safety and salaries at the heart of their provisions. Now, Costa Rica is a pretty well-functioning state in it's a middle-income country compared to the rest of the developing world. It has pretty good regulations, it has good labor laws. However, right, in Costa Rica, at the beginning of our sample, close to a third of workers were paid below the minimum wage. And the Ministry of Labor just said, like, look, there's no way that we can enforce anything here because we don't have the resources to do so. So that was the state, like, at the beginning of our sample. So it's not crazy to think that for small scale services establishments, these formal codes of conduct could have an impact. That's the basic message. Like, I mean, that's how we rationalize what we're going to find. That's the basic message I want to give you on the way before jumping into the data. So empirical evidence. We're going to have basic event studies. So in the most basic form, think of Costa Rican suppliers, two multinationals. That's the supplier I in sector 4-digit sector S at year T. I'm going to take sector by time fixed effects. I'm going to take a supplier fixed effects. And then I'm going to basically estimate the timeline of outcomes in the years before the supplier was exposed to a supplier code of conduct. So this timeline is going to switch on for any supplier in Costa Rica that was supplying to a multinational in the year eta -1, before the supplier rolled out a supplier code of conduct. Okay, so if you were supplying to the multinational in the year before the supplier code of conduct, this timeline is going to switch on. And I'm going to show you in the graphs like 4 years before, 4 years after. Of course, we have all the time periods in there, but we have 10 years of data, so that's pretty much what we get. So a standard timeline, event study setup. So what could go wrong here? So the first thing is sort of what we already discussed with Federico is like, they targeted at local productivity shocks. So I don't think it's the case, but we're going to use global rollouts as an IV for all rollouts. That's going to be a very strong IV. It's going to be 85% of the variation. So, these are basically global rollouts. So it's probably not going to be targeted at domestic, contemporaneous productivity shocks. There's other things in different setting that you should do, which has to do with negative weights and confounding trends. So if you do an event study design, you're taking care of a lot of the standard pre and post comparison problems, including that the post period of treated guys could still be trending, right? If there's dynamic effects. So we already have the dynamic effects like dummied out. We already have the timeline. What could still go wrong in this setting is that cohorts of suppliers that were treated in the early sample years have different dynamic timelines of effects than cohorts treated after, which I have no good intuition why that should be the case, but we check for this by using the estimator by Abraham and Sun, which is basically targeted at this in an event study set. And then the third one is, we are defining the timeline of treatments if you've been selling to a multinational that was rolling out an RS event in the year before. So our sample is only suppliers that have ever sold to a multinational. So we already restrict, right? It's not anybody, it's sellers to multinationals in general over this timeline. But I'm basically, it could be the case that I'm picking a lucky year for you. Like you lucked out and you got hired by a multinational in year eta -1. And that would lead to a mechanical positive pre-trend and a negative post-trend. If it's just a stochastic event that dropped on you, you had a lucky year, and I'm going to pick you out. And that's exactly what we're going to find. So what I'm also going to do is to introduce the full timeline of selling to any multinational, because you don't sell to multinational every year. Nobody does that, or very few companies do this. So I'm going to have the full timeline of selling to any multinational layered on top of this. So this is basically conditional on selling to any multinational. What is the effect of having sold to a multinational that rolls out of a supplier code of conduct? And that's what I'm going to show you in the next class. I'm going to get to this later. We also have the firm worker data or the firm supplier fixed effects in there, and I'm going to get to that later. So what happens to the exposed suppliers compared to other suppliers to other multinationals in sales and employment? That's these timelines here. And these were the kind of event study graphs where we were thinking about what is happening here, and it doesn't seem to be hot air. Okay, so these are the first figures that got us thinking. So roughly 4 years after, you see a 7% decrease in sales and a 6% decrease in employment. And the next iteration, I'm going to give you the point estimate. If you pool all the post periods, that's going to be closer to like 9% here, and it's going to be closer to like 8% here if you pool all the post periods. Okay. Now, coming to the heterogeneity question that was done by Marco earlier, like what is driving this average effect on sales? I'm going to zoom in on sales. The average effect on sales is driven by smaller suppliers and entirely by suppliers in the services sector. So we have 80% of suppliers that are in the service sector. These guys are small. So think of small, unregulated or relatively unregulated suppliers. That's what's driving these negative sales. In terms of multinationals, it tends to be from higher, like headquarters in higher GDP per capita countries. So think of US and Europe, and with above median management scores. That's not at the firm level. That's at the country level. We also have this now for like labor standard regulations. All of these things are pretty correlated. So it's basically large multinationals from rich countries that have bite in these policies. Okay, in terms of heterogeneity, and small unregulated suppliers. So here I'm going to show you the effects on workers, and let me go to the event study. So here I have worker I employed at supplier J. So I take a worker firm fixed effect. So these are workers that were there before the supplier code of conduct was rolled out, and they're workers that stay at the firm. So that's what I'm going to use to see what happens to wages of the identical people, right, in the identical firms. I'm not going to estimate what happens to the people that they let go, which is interesting, but I want to know what happens to their salaries of the same people with the same timeline as I do here. So on average, you see this like slightly going up. And if you look at the quartiles, so the light blue is the bottom quartile of the initial wage distribution in Costa Rica. So this is the first time I see any worker, I'm going to mark their wages according to the first time I see anybody in the data, and I'm going to call you the lowest quarter of wages, or the highest quarter of wages, or the middle. And you see that the wages, this average effect is driven by initially low wage workers. There's something going on in the middle, right? Like they're like sort of in the middle of this, and then there's, if you take the 4 or after point estimate of the 4 of the high wage workers, the top quarter, that's going to sit here, which is what I'm going to use in the model calibration to say that there don't seem to be productivity effects that affect all workers, which of course is this stark assumption that that's how you estimate productivity. But that's what we find on the worker front. Consistent with that, you see the relative employment going down. Okay, so the relative employment of low-wage workers is going down by about 12 to 13% afterwards, if you take the log ratio of those employments. So what happens to the sales to the RSM&E on the extensive and intensive margin? So this is PPML that has the zeros in there, and this is just a firm like supplier-buyer fixed effect. Okay, so supplier-buyer fixed effect means you were selling to the multinational before, you're still selling to the multinational after. So you saw in the model that those statistics were like either ambiguous or strictly positive or strictly negative in some of the versions. We see both of them, if anything, being negative. Okay, and like all of these effects, like the fact that employment, like the fact that sales aren't going up, the fact that both the intensive and extensive margin to the RSM&E is going down, they all sort of rule out this nice story that there was a big market imperfection that the multinational steps into and increases wages and increases efficiency. The labor market monopoly. What happens to the sales to non-RS buyers? They're going down. The point estimate pooled across 4 would be somewhere here, which is what we're going to use in the calibration. And now I'm turning to what happens to the subsidiary that rolls out the RS. So this is now no longer a timeline of you were a supplier that was exposed. This is at the subsidiary level or at the M&E level. What happens to their sales? And you see a big, flat statistical zero. So no crazy pre-trends going on either in the subsidiary in Costa Rica or in the global Orbis data. And while the suppliers are significantly affected, you don't see sales going up or down at the subsidiary level. I'm going to rationalize that through the lens of the model, but to get back to Federico, so in a first step, I'm going to treat the lack of pre-trends here as reassuring that this is not coming. For example, after the multinational was exposed to a negative ad campaign that had very negative effects on the multinational, and in that environment they roll out a supply code of conduct. Or another story where they had a big productivity boost, and at the same time they also roll out a supply code of conduct. It doesn't seem to be there. We have additional, that's why we collected this NGO campaign database. And what we're finding is that the decision to roll out a responsible sourcing event is not driven by being hit by a negative ad campaign. There's tens of thousands of these negative ad campaigns targeted at multinationals every year, which is crazy. It's really cool data. So you don't see that responsible sourcing decisions are affected by it, but you do see that multinational sales are going down after. So those ad campaigns, negative ad campaigns on sourcing conditions, have a negative effect on Orbis level, so global sales of multinationals, when you link them, but they don't seem to be driving the decision of these supplier codes of conduct, which in my mind makes sense. If you roll out a supplier code of conduct for all of your suppliers globally, worldwide, you have to do a lot of homework if you want to enforce it, and also careful about thinking what you're doing to your bottom line. So I think these are, the good way for us to read this is that these are longer term strategic considerations that multinationals take seriously, and they're not targeted at market movements either in their stock price or what happens to local suppliers. Is the nice way of reading these graphs.
Pedro,
yeah.
Marco here again. I have a question about, do you have any sense of some sort of a profit measure or markups at these M&Es, whether they're affected? Because maybe sales are not being affected, but what about their cost? So maybe when you were saying that they're not willing to pay anything for it, maybe they are going to indirectly pay for it by purchasing more expensive materials or other inputs. So I don't know.
I mean, at least that's how I think about it. If you assume, or if you accept that firms face downward sloping demand in a competitive market, and you see that nothing happens to sales, then they can't have a big shock to their cost, unless they also contemporaneously invested in productivity increases that they for some reason thought was not worth their while before. Right. So I mean, of course it's possible, right, to rationalize this, but it doesn't smack like the cost of the multinational seems to have gone up tremendously. So how is the model going to rationalize this? How can it be that they seem to have increased the cost to the domestic suppliers and nothing seems to happen to their own sales? There's a couple of possibilities that we're going to, in the calibration, tease apart from one another. One is that the cost is not passed on. Another one is that there's a contemporaneous demand shock to the multinational that offsets the cost increase. Remember, the cost could go up, but you shift your demand curve out because consumers in the world, your buyers, care about your TAO. They care about your sourcing policy. And I'm going to show you in the calibration how we're going to tease this apart. But yeah, on your measure of profits, do we have good profit information? I think for the Costa Rican subsidiary, we could have hope because we have the corporate filings. For the Orbis level data, I don't think you have a good handle on. You see employment and you see global sales and you see assets. That's what you see.
I was thinking materials, whether those, I know you don't observe prices, so it's harder, but maybe there was a way to tease out how, I don't know, the ratio of sales to costs is changing or something about.
No, we can. So for the global, so for the local subsidiary, we can totally do this. And we have the transaction data, so we have the import and export data, so we can really take a deep dive into what these firms were sourcing before and what they're sourcing after. If there's some kind of qualitative shift, I mean, obviously you would expect there to be a shift in the domestic sourcing, right? There's selection of people complying with this, yeah, I would have to think through, right? Because the responsible sourcing is going to affect all of their purchases. And then, but maybe across sectors, right? Like nothing in our model would say that you're sourcing from one sector more than a different sector, like you're using different types of inputs. So the different cost shares of different types of inputs. We could look at that. That's a good suggestion. Okay, calibration. So how we're going to take the model to the data. So the upshot is, so in the future versions of this, each one of these graphs will have the point estimates that I'm showing you. So take the first ones, the point estimates that I'm showing you, and it's going to have a separate timeline of event study dummies, where instead of keeping all the event timelines in there, so here we have all the event timelines, I'm showing you -4 to 4. I'm going to estimate that same thing, but I'm going to pool the event study at 4 or above. And I'm going to show you that point estimate, and then that point estimate is what I'm going to use to calibrate the model in the following way. So the same event studies, just pooling it 4 or above years after. So what do I need to know? I need to know the size of the labor-related cost shock to low-wage workers, the productivity shock, the fraction of pass-through of the increased cost of the supplies to the multinational, the theta parameter of the domestic productivity distribution, the potential shift in the demand curve for the multinational, the elasticity of substitution between workers and production, the rho, and the elasticity of substitution, so the demand elasticity that firms are facing. So the approach that I'm going to take is, I'm going to take an estimate of the demand that firms are facing from Isabella and José's job market paper, that estimated this in a fully consistent way with our model in a monopolistic competition setting with heterogeneous firms in Costa Rica. And I'm just going to use one estimate of this, right? Like no sector specificity at this point, just like it's 5.03, in case you were wondering, for Costa Rican firms, okay? That's the demand elasticity that firms are facing. So once I have that demand elasticity, I can back out the cost increase in production by looking at sales responses rather than taking the stance that I have to see it all in wages going up. And I can do a different, like a set of different things. In particular, I can write down a system of comparative static equations from the model. So this is comparing an exposed supplier to a non-exposed supplier and seeing what happens to their outcomes if you're hit by one responsible sourcing code of conduct, which is exactly what we have in the empirics. I can take the sales response on the intensive margin among compliers to the RSMNE. So that's the supplier buyer fixed effects one that I was showing you, 4 years or after above. That is going to be, so that difference is going to be, if that's going up or down, whatever it is going to be a function of the extent of pass-through to the multinational, the size of the cost shock, the cost share of low-wage workers in production, and what happens to the demand of the multinational in global markets. Okay, so there's 3 parameters in there. I can use the exposure to non-RS buyers, so the sales response of domestic firms, like of exposed suppliers, to non-RS buyers compared to non-exposed suppliers. And what's that a function of? That's just going to be a function of the demand that they face, which I already know, and the cost shock. Okay, this is the cost shock just scaled to the cost share of the workers that are affected. Right. So then I have 2 equations in currently 3 unknowns. And then I need the 4th unknown, which is the selection margin, and that's the shape of the productivity distribution. That's going to have to do with entry and exit, the extensive margin. So that's going to be the total sales response of suppliers. That's going to have all 4 of these parameters in there: the theta, the beta, the size of the cost shock, tau, and the potential demand shifted to the multinational. And a 4th moment, which is going to be the sales of the RSMNE, which is going to be, of course, indicative of what happens to the cost shock as well as all the other parameters. So I have 4 equations that are going to be empirical moments in the event study and 4 unknowns. And the parameters I need to know is what demand are these firms facing, what's the cost share of the low-wage workers, and what is the cost share of CR supply, no, what is the average sales share of CR suppliers to the multinational? These are the moments I need. So here's the same slide where the only thing I've done is to fill out the point estimates for 4 years or more. So this is the point estimate on complier sales, so the complying firms to the RSMNE, what's happening to your sales to the same multinational after they roll out a supply code of conduct. That tends to be negative on average. What happens to the sales to non-MNE buyers? That's going to be this point estimate here. What happens to the total sales of exposed suppliers compared to non-exposed suppliers? That's this point estimate here. And what happens to the sales of the RSMNE? That's the only point estimate that's not statistically significantly estimated, which is the statistical 0. Okay, so here I'm just going to take that point estimate, even though it's not statistically significantly estimated. And those 4 point estimates are going to give me that the cost shock to low-wage workers is roughly 10%. So that's about double what they get in earnings. The shape parameter of the domestic productivity distribution is going to be close to 7. The pass-through to the multinational is not perfect, but also not crazily low. It's 0.86. And the cost, like the demand shock, like 4 years or more after, is very small and slightly positive, and that of course has to do with this guy here. Okay, so of course this is still a stylized model that we have, and like one of the things that we're working on, like the way that I'm estimating the pass through to the multinational, which is going to be really important for what happens to welfare, is going to be pinned down by almost, like, imagine the demand shock is 0 to the multinational. In that case, you get the pass-through to the multinational by just taking the ratio of those two things. The ratio of the sales on the intensive margin to the multinational compared to sales to other non-RS buyers, where this thing is not buying. That gives you, if you know the elasticity of demand, you see that both of them have the cost shock. The ratio of those two is going to give you the beta fraction, right? So how does your sales go down to non-RS buyers compared to the RS MNE? That's going to have to do with the market power of the MNE. If your sales are going down less to the RS MNE, that is suggestive that you're passing on a lower fraction of your cost. Is the logic in our calibration that we're using here. Now, of course, that is crucially dependent on both the multinational and the domestic suppliers facing the same demand. And that's an assumption. We just say, it's 5 for everybody here. But in versions that we're working on right now, we're going to separately estimate the elasticity of demand that the multinationals are facing compared to domestic suppliers to see, if that's a meaningful shortcut or not. That's one of the things we're working on, just to be hands above the table. So what else do I need to calibrate? I need to calibrate the elasticity of substitution between labor types. What's going to give that? I know the cost shock tau. I know the cost shock tau to the different labor types. Now I just need to look at what happens to relative employment. So I take a log of relative employment of low wage to high wage workers, defined as the top quarter, low wage to high wage workers, to back out the row, which is going to be 1.15 in this setting, just from those two things, that the cost shock is 11% from the previous thing, and the observed shock to relative employment that I've shown you on the graphs. And then here I'm going to conclude from the fact that the top quarter of workers don't see an increase in their wages. I'm going to interpret that as saying that there's no overall productivity shock to the firm. Having said that, I'm not assuming that the wage increase of the low wage workers is only going to be driven by cost increases. That's just coming from the sales effect. But we're going to assume that nothing happens to productivity because we don't see anything happening in the return to the top quarter of workers, which is an assumption, but model consistent how we do this.
Ben, sorry, a small question, I missed this.
Yeah.
So what's the control group in the theory here? You're comparing this to an average firm or a firm that sells to a multinational but a different one? What's the comparison?
A firm that's selling to a multinational who doesn't roll out a supply code of conduct. So you and I, okay. I guess it's that story of Pepsi and Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola rolls it out, Pepsi doesn't. What happens to your timeline after Coca-Cola does it and Pepsi didn't do it? That's the ideal version, but in the model, that's exactly what we do.
And that's what you were doing in the event study as well?
In the event study, these are all suppliers to multinationals at some point. And then I'm comparing your timeline of outcomes, right? And I'm controlling for selling to any multinational, right? So this is as close as I think we can get with this data to exactly that, which is these are previously similar firms that don't have different trends. And then at eta 0, one of them gets shocked with a supply code of conduct. And I'm comparing firms that were selling to that supplier at eta -1 to a firm that was selling to a different set of suppliers at eta -1.
Good. You have 5 minutes, by the way.
Okay, cool. Okay, so that's the calibration, and actually that works. So so now I know all of these things in the way. So I've taken the event study, I've set up a system of equations to back out exactly these moments, and the main assumption I've made is that I know the demand that firms are facing. Right? The alternative route would have been, I don't know what the demand is that firms are facing, but I see what's happening to their marginal cost by seeing what happens to salaries to workers. Right? Like that would have been the alternative route to take. I'm more comfortable with this one, especially because we can easily play around with different sigmas, right? Like if you don't like this sigma, I can play around with any sigma in the model and show you what happens to wealth. Okay. The additional moments we need from the database, just 3 ones that are going to be important for the, right? So what I'm going to do in the welfare analysis now is I'm going to have the full model, not the toy version with the first order welfare effect, but the full thing. And I'm going to go from an equilibrium without responsible sourcing to an equilibrium where the observed share of multinational production in Costa Rica is rolling out responsible sourcing. For that, so what's that observed share? It's 55% of multinational subsidiary production in Costa Rica is rolling out a supplier code of conduct by 2019. So that's what I'm going to use. What is the share of Costa Rican exports done by firms who are also selling to multinationals? 62%. That's going to matter, of course, it's going to matter in the model, like who's exposed to this. And what is the share of M&E subsidiary production done by M&Es with, I flipped this last one. 47% of multinational production is rolling out a supplier code of conduct. And the first one is, what is the share of Costa Rican production done by firms also selling to M&Es? That's 55%. Okay, so these moments I need just to scale what happens in the alternative equilibrium when responsible sourcing is rolled out. And here's just one graph, and of course, right, we can have tons of robustness analysis across different parameters, but here's the main graph that we're sticking to at the moment. So we're breaking up the welfare into low-wage workers, high-wage workers, and low-wage workers employed at suppliers that were exposed to multinational sourcing, exposed to responsible sourcing, and workers that were not exposed to responsible sourcing. So you see that if you just look at all low-wage workers in Costa Rica, so 20% of them work at suppliers that were ever exposed to responsible sourcing, and 80% work at suppliers that were never exposed to responsible sourcing. So this is the vast majority of low-wage workers. Low-wage workers are the bottom quarter in the wage distribution in Costa Rica. So the bottom quarter of workers. Responsible sourcing, if you read the policy documents, is meant to benefit exactly these workers, right? Low-wage workers with all the provisions binding for them, and we don't see evidence that anything is binding for other workers. So those guys who luck out, right? So these are identical workers in our model, right? So in our model, these are all low-wage workers, and then some of them happen to work at suppliers that get hit by responsible sourcing codes, and some of them don't. We do not condition on you being a lucky one of staying employed, right? So this group here is fully taken into account that many of them will be fired and will fall onto the domestic labor market. And when they fall onto the domestic labor market, in general equilibrium, if like 40% of domestic production is exposed to this, there are RGE effects, okay? In particular, you see a shift in labor demand away from low-wage workers and towards high-wage workers. So their wages are going down in general equilibrium if you fall onto the domestic labor market. So if you were at the firms without the luck of being exposed to responsible sourcing, your real wages are going down, both because your nominal wage is going down and because the domestic price index goes up. Why is the domestic price index going up? Because 40% of domestic production has to pay a tau to a factor of production, and that leaks into the domestic price index. So, and then in aggregate, you see very little, right? Which is, kind of reassuring to me. Like if we had found that Costa Rica has grown 5% because of responsible sourcing, I would have been a little hesitant. So you see in aggregate, nothing much happens for either worker type, but you see these interesting distributional effects within a worker group, okay? So even though low-wage workers are marginally better affected than high-wage workers see an increase in their wages, but as a group, low-wage workers are benefiting and slightly more so than high-wage workers. So if you wanted to focus on this, like forget about this graph, scale everything to like below 1%. I can show you like heterogeneity between low-wage workers and high-wage workers. But what really matters is that 20% of low-wage workers see a big increase in welfare, but 80% see a decrease. As a group, they still benefit because the increase is big and the decrease is small. As a group, they still benefit, but of course, responsible sourcing has no transfer provisions in there, right? So if you wanted to benefit the majority of low-wage workers, according to this set of results that we have right now, this wouldn't be a good idea, but you would benefit low-wage workers working at suppliers of exposed firms. But in the aggregate, you would not do a service to the majority of low-wage workers, and high-wage workers in the rest of the economy are close to indifferent to this policy. That's the current takeaway that we have. Okay, with that, I'm going to conclude. We try to learn about responsible sourcing both through the lens of theory and then with a new database. The first conclusion is responsible sourcing doesn't seem to be just hot air. conditional, and this is like even in a context of a middle-income country with pretty good regulations and state capability, right? So there's not talking about the Congo or Cambodia, there's talking about Costa Rica. Number two, if it's not just hot air, it's interesting to think through the incidents. And I have to confess that I often sat in these meetings with Global Witness and Amnesty International and getting very agitated with the claims that these, and the ILO in particular, with the claims that these institutions made about like how this is going to be a great thing. As an economist, the first thing that comes to your mind is like, what market imperfection are these multinationals addressing exactly here? And then you can come up with externalities that are not being internalized that the multinational is doing. But to me, it wasn't clear at all if this is a good idea for the domestic, for the home economy of sourcing. And it wasn't clear to me that the basic breakdown is going to be one of an export tax and the labor market distortion, with all these added bells and whistles on top of that. So what we're finding is that a priori is ambiguous through the lens of a national model to write down. And then in the Costa Rican case, when we quantify it, we see large welfare gains for exposed low-wage workers as a group that are counteracted by a decrease in the real wages of the majority of the wage workers. And I'm going to leave it at that.
Great, thanks a lot, Ben. We have a couple of minutes for more questions, so feel free to just jump in.
I have a question, Gustavo, here from the bank. Hi, Ben. If you go back to the last graph that you showed, like the one with the bars, that one. So you say that exposed low-wage workers get benefit from the RS policy, but given that, I mean, that sector, like the sector that is exposed to this regulation, actually like shrinks in size, wouldn't this like exposed low-wage workers be a smaller group of the total group of low-wage workers? Like in some sense, like if you weight like each group by its relative size, you could still have like low-wage workers to be like worse off than before, because you could like push some workers, low-wage workers, to the non-exposed sector where they are facing lower wages.
Yeah, so I could have vastly, or not vastly, but I could have increased this graph by conditioning on low-wage workers that are continuing to be employed at the exposed suppliers. I didn't want to do that just because the accounting here is simple, right? So 20% of workers in low-wage workers, so that's the bottom quarter of Costa Rican workers, 20% of the bottom quarter of Costa Rican workers work at establishments that get exposed to responsible sourcing by 2019. And for that group of 20%, some of them will see their welfare go down because they get fired and they land in this labor market here, or in unemployment, which we haven't talked about, but we can. But here I'm just grouping them, right? So an average for this group is going to be roughly 9% increase, and like I think that's transparent to think about the policy ex ante, right? So you don't know who exactly is going to be let go before and after, but you look at a country and you see like, okay, so now these multinationals want to impose supplier codes of conduct with responsible sourcing. Which firms are going to be exposed to this, and which workers as a group are going to benefit compared to are going to lose? This would have been much higher if you had conditioned on the lucky ones that get to stay. And then this would have been, and then this could have been, this probably wouldn't have moved much, because this is just the GE effect on price indices and the equilibrium. But I don't think the conclusions would meaningfully change. So it's true that fewer of these people here are going to stay at exposed firms, but that's counted in the average here, right? So that's counted in the average welfare. Like those losses are in here, are in this graph.
Okay. Okay, so thank you.